just do it sometimes. I've been told I have a calming voice, so this is what I use it for. Also, hello Quachi, welcome to the channel. Also, thank you for the follow. I'm doing passable today. How are you doing today? I hope you all are well. You sound hoarse? Well, I am doing kind of a whispered voice right now. Do I? I hope I don't sound, Jen just wanted to tell you, Green, I got the sketch of the art piece. Nice, nice. I look forward to seeing it. But yes, when it comes to ASMR, I like to do bedtime. I like to read stories. Did you hear about the restaurant on the moon? I did not. What's the punchline? Great food, no atmosphere. This is the part where if I was in a Discord call, I would laugh loudly. Where I do the little bit. Actually, wait. I wonder if that can be an ASMR trigger. I don't know too much about ASMR triggers, to be honest with you. Jana's gonna go. She's got some stuff to do. Alright, well, I hope you have a good rest of your night. As for the rest of you, I'm here to assist you guys in falling asleep, as I have my book here, and I will continue, and I will read bedtime story. If you are just joining us, we're reading RWBY Roman Holiday, and we are actually on chapter 21 out of 26. So we're going to try to finish this book tonight, which is only 6 chapters, so it shouldn't be too bad. But, are you ready? Let us get started. Chapter 21, Fury Road. Roman woke up groggy in the back of a convoy. His hands and legs were tied, and he was buckled into a seat. Slowly, through a throbbing headache, he remembered what had happened. Little Miss Malachite had captured him, and was taking him back to Mistral. Neapolitan had turned him over, after he had spent months teaching her everything he knew, except how to double-cross someone. She was a natural at that. He pulled on his bonds, testing whether he could slide one of his hands free, but he'd been tied up real good. He wasn't alone back here either. There were 4 spiders guarding him, and 2 more in the front, one driving and another riding shotgun. We've got incoming, one of them said. Looks like one of He Xiong's fleet. Should we fire on them? They're getting kinda close. What's that hanging out at the back? It looks like a girl? Roman's ears perked up. He craned his neck to try to look out the front window. He managed to unbuckle his seat and hopped out to the front. Get back there. The goon in the passenger seat smacked him in the forehead with the butt of his rifle. Roman tumbled backward. The knock on his head wasn't doing his headache any favors, and for a moment he saw stars. But he had also seen a beautiful sight. Neapolitan was holding onto a line dangling from the back of a bullhead, paragliding with her umbrella. I hope that thing holds, he thought. He heard a thud on the roof of the convoy. What was that? That girl! She's on top of us! The convoy swerved back and forth on the road, bouncing Roman painfully all over the back of the convoy. One of the spiders finally grabbed him and held him in place on the floor with a heavy boot to the groin. Thanks, Roman groaned. I'm sure we lost her, the driver said. The footsteps on the roof proved him wrong. A clang and a sword tip appeared on the metal. It started to move in a circle, like a can opener. The 4 spiders on the back started firing at the roof. Roman heard an intermittent drumbeat as Neo dodged the gunfire, and then it stopped. The spiders kept shooting for a while it seemed like the coast was clear. She's hanging off the right side, the spider in the front called out then. Hold on, she's gone. Must have fallen. The circular cutout in the roof fell in, and Neo landed in the center of the convoy. What? One of the spiders shouted. Neo quickly surveyed the situation, counting the spiders and taking note of Roman. She moved toward him even as they tried to shoot her, swinging her parasol to deflect the guns, to shoot at one another. More bullet holes appeared in the roof, sides, and floors of the convoy. The metal groaned under the stress, and the ride got bumpy again. As Neo reached Roman, she whipped her parasol out to cut the ropes binding his hands and feet. She continued the motion to bring the parasol behind her and popped it open, just as more bullets rained down on the two of them. The reinforced canopy blocked the artillery, which bounced off and ricocheted throughout the cabin, causing yet more structural damage. "Nice of you to drop in," Roman said. Neo rolled her eyes and handed him her cane. His cane. He kissed it, then looked at Neo. "Hey, we haven't been separated for 4 years." Neo tipped her head behind her. "I know. On 3. Neo turned and put her back against Roman's, still holding her parasol up as a shield. He counted silently, holding up his fingers so she could see them. 1, 2, 3. On 3, Neo and Roman moved counterclockwise, switching places. Roman fired a flare from his cane at the spiders, and they scattered out of the way. The flare blew a hole in the side of the convoy, which shuddered and veered wide. It hit the center divider and scraped alongside it, sparks flying through the air. The convoy jerked to the right, knocking Roman out of the gaping hole in the side. Neo reached out for him as he fell behind the vehicle. He fired the grappling hook in his cane toward the top of the convoy, and it caught on. He instantly retracted the line to pull him onto the roof. Neo had anchored the line from the bullhead to the roof of the convoy. Roman grabbed onto it with one hand and then extended the handle of his cane down into the vehicle. Neo hooked the handle of her parasol around, and it lifted her up. Neo grabbed onto the line too, and when he nodded, she sliced through the end of it, separating it from the convoy. They held on tight as they lifted higher and drifted away from the road. Pieces of the vehicle were falling off, and it didn't look like it would last much longer. Shots rang out at them from the passenger seat and new vantage points at the side. More shots came from little Miss Malachite's ride in the front. The woman herself was watching him and Neo intently. Roman looked up and began climbing up to the bullhead as quickly as he could, Neo right behind him. When they reached the aircraft's cargo area, Neo moved to the front of the ship to disengage the autolock, while Roman closed up the doors. He took a moment to catch his breath, and settle his stomach, and clutch his aching head. Then he joined Neo in the cockpit, taking the co-pilot's seat. "How'd you learn to fly this thing?" Roman asked. Neo held up her scroll. "How to fly a bullhead," Roman read. "You've always been a quick study." They sat in silence for a while, which was pretty common, but this time it was awkward because there was too much that needed to be said. But since Roman could speak, he went first. "You put another tracker in my hat," she giggled. "And I'm guessing you didn't actually turn me into little Miss Malachite," Roman said. Neo shook her head emphatically. Then she tilted her hand back and forth. "It's complicated." Neo shook her head. She tapped at her scroll and started sending him pre-written text messages. Roman scrolled through the history of the text messages Neo had written that night, building a picture of what she had been through and what was at stake. "Wow," Roman said. "So you did make a deal with Lady Browning, but changed your mind about turning me over." She shrugged. "Neo, I forgive you. Trust me, I've done a lot worse. The important thing is you rescued me. Actions speak louder than words." Neo grinned. "Only problem is, I don't have this data drive you mentioned to Zhang." Neo reached into her pocket and pulled out a metal brick. She tossed it to Roman and he caught it clumsily. "Okay then," he said. "Now what? You've pitted Zhang against little Miss Malachite, and they're both going to want this data. And us. The police are working with Zhang too. How do we turn this," he held up the data drive, "into a winning scenario for us? Where do we even go where we'll be safe?" Even though he'd had an involuntary nap not long ago, he was exhausted. Too much adrenaline and anxiety. He needed a rest to clear his head, figure out the next move. Neo pursed her lips. She sighed, and then turned their ship south. Chapter 22. 2 for tea. For the first time in 6 months, Neo saw the house she had grown up in. She had never had a view quite like this one, of course, looking down on it from above. It loomed larger in her imagination, but from here it was small, more like a doll's house. It was amazing what a little change in perspective could do. I thought we were going to your house, Roman said. Neo looked at him. She threw her left hand out, gesturing toward the house. Is it behind the mansion? He asked. Neo put her hand to her forehead. She shook her head. You live there? Roman asked. She stretched the right side of her mouth and shrugged. Right, not anymore since you went to school. But Neo didn't live at the school anymore either, not after stealing the data drive and trying to expose Lady Beat and Little Mrs. Racket. If she didn't live here either, then where did she belong? I'm guessing they know we're coming since this thing makes a lot of noise. Where are you gonna put us down? She circled the house once. They had repaired damage to the left into her old wing on the top floor, like nothing had ever happened, like she'd never even been there. Neo brought them down on the front lawn with a jarring stop. She'd have to practice her landings. Then she just sat there. Let's go? Roman asked. The front door opened and her parents appeared. She hadn't seen them in the last 6 months either. Mama stayed in the doorway while Papa stopped toward the bullhead in his bathrobe. Hey, what do you think you're doing? You can't park that here, he shouted. Roman put a hand on Neo's arm. You're afraid of talking to them after everything you've done in the last 6 months. After tonight, you jumped out of a plane tonight. You fought a group of spiders in a moving vehicle. You faced down Vale's toughest crime boss and stole his property. Nia smiled and wagged her finger, then pointed at Roman. Right, I'm the toughest crime boss in Vale. He looked upward. I'll remember that. What I'm getting at is you are astounding, and I'll be right there with you. Neo blinked back tears and hugged Roman. Hey, don't wrinkle the suit. But he put a hand on her head and over her shoulder, and that felt more like home than that house and her parents had in a long time. Neo took a deep breath. She stood up and changed into a brown-haired, brown-eyed girl they'd expected. Roman shook his head. Show them who you really are. Neo changed back into herself, but swapped out her school uniform for her favorite suit. Roman handed her his parasol. They opened the cargo bays and walked down to the ramp to the lawn. Papa met them there. I'm calling the cops, you hear me? He shouted. Please don't, Roman said. We've had kind of a rough night. Who? Papa stepped closer. Roman Torchwick. You can't be here. And you... He turned to look at Neo, but it took him a moment to really see her. His face registered shock, sadness, and finally settled on anger. Neo folded her arms. She wasn't sure what she had been expecting. Trivia, what are you doing with this criminal? Papa said. Neo put her hand on Roman's arm and shook her head. He's not a criminal. He's my friend. Well, I guess he's both. Her father threw up his hands. Do you know what she wants to say? He asked Roman. I do, actually. Roman looked at her fondly. I'm surprised you don't. Defeated, Neo took out her scroll and typed. He's my friend. A real friend. Papa's eyebrows shot up. We sent you to school to keep you from getting in trouble. Yeah, about that. Mama came running down the lawn. Trivia! Trivia! She grabbed Trivia in a hug. Oh, I've missed you. How are you? Oh, who's this? She looked at Roman. That is Roman Torchwick, Papa said. Torchwick? She drew away. Here? Trivia, what's going on? Roman cleared his throat. Her name is Neo. Mama looked confused. Neo? Neapolitan? She looked at Trivia. Is that what you're calling yourself now? Neo looked at the ground, hands folded together. She nodded. Well, I still need an explanation for why you're here and where you got this. Papa gaped at the bullhead. This is Heishong's. It's a long story. Mind if we, crash here for the night? Neo jabbed him in the side with her elbow. Okay, the landing wasn't that bad. This is Trivia's home, Mama said. She's always welcome here, and her friends will have plenty of time to sort out all of this once you've had a chance to rest. Neo felt a tiny surge of warmth and affection at her mother's words. She hadn't heard from her parents since she'd been enrolled at the academy, so she had assumed they had all but forgotten her. Papa nodded distractingly. Yes, of course. It's good to have you home, Trivia. She forced a smile. Neo had become better at reading people in her time at the academy. She knew Papa was hiding something, but it wasn't like she and Roman had any better option at the moment. They just needed to recover a little, and then they could move on. Probably won't be long before someone finds this. Roman kicked the side of the aircraft. And us. Who's looking for you? Papa asked. I have a right to know if you're under our roof. Roman walked toward the house. As he passed her father, he tipped his hat. Oh, everyone, really. Take your pick. Neo shrugged and ran after him. So, you're rich, Roman said, lounging on the sofa beside her with his feet up on the antique coffee table. Even now, the gesture made her wince. She sat on the edge of the cushion, back straight, trying not to touch anything. She had been punished for just playing in this room as a kid. It was used only for her father's business meetings. Guests like Heishong, apparently. You could have mentioned that at least once. Maybe before we went out to steal something, you probably could have put on Daddy's credit card. He nodded at her parasol. You could have paid for that by yourself. Neo shot him an annoyed look. Roman put his hands up in surrender. Sorry, I know it isn't your money. Yet. He winked. But it's still a lot to take in. There's a giant portrait of you on that wall right behind you, and it's kind of freaking me out. Neo hated that painting. It showed her and her parents posing together as if they were a happy family. But it was all a lie. Right down to the two brown eyes on 12-year-old Trivia. For all her parents' criticism of her imagination, it was them who had been living in a fantasy. You were a cute kid. What happened to you? Neo sighed. I'm kidding. Come on, you're usually the fun one. Being back here really bothers you, huh? She glanced up to the ceiling. That was an understatement. Roman kept staring at the family portrait. There's something off about this picture. Neo waved her hand and fixed the color of her right eye in the portrait. Roman snapped his fingers. Much better. Neo's mother and father came in. Mama carried a tray with teapot, teacups, and Neo's favorite little cakes. Neo was surprised. They still had those around for when she wasn't even home. Tea? Mama asked. The glasses rattled on the tray. Her hands shook and she was squeezing the handles of the tray so hard her knuckles were white. Neo didn't know why she was so nervous. Roman wasn't the first criminal she had entertained at her home. Absolutely. Thanks, Miss Finiel. I'm starving, Roman said. Please, call me Carmel. Mama poured tea, sloshing a fair bit of it out of the cup. He picked up the cup and showed it around so everyone knew he was holding it properly with his pinky sticking out. Neo sipped her tea sullenly. She made a face. Tea usually made everything better, but even this tasted wrong somehow. Too bitter. It was very strange to have Roman here with her parents, like her two worlds were pulling at her. She started to feel more like Trivia than Neo again, and it was unsettling. She didn't want to stay here. Mama and Papa exchanged uncertain glances. You can stay the night, Torchwick, Papa said. Tomorrow morning you will leave, without our daughter. Neo looked at Roman in alarm. He glanced at her, and then he downed the rest of his cup and threw it against the wall. Neo flinched at the sound of the breaking glass. She looked at her parents worriedly. What were they going to do? That was unnecessary. Mama wrung her fingers together. We can't harbor criminals here, Papa said. Neo laughed, but it came out sounding like a hiccup. Nia laughed. She pointed a finger at her dad. What are you implying? Papa asked angrily. She transformed into Hei Zhong for the second time that night. Her father visibly recoiled. Roman watched all of this with interest. You're in with the Zhong family, eh? I manage business contracts for the city, Papa said. That requires me to deal with a lot of people. Then you're definitely in with them. Every businessman works with him or for him. Or he has something on them. What does Zhong have on you? Kickbacks, I bet. Giving him insider knowledge? Plum deals? You made him the biggest dust distributor. That's enough, Jimmy said. Roman looked around. City employees typically don't live this good, which is why they all work with the crime syndicates. Roman put his fingers and thumbs together to make a circle. The circle of life. How dare you? Papa advanced toward Roman, but Mama held him back. I will not be lectured in my own home by a low-rent crook. Low rent? My rent is at the top of the scale for Vale, and it's probably going to get higher because of the damages. Nia narrowed her eyes. Papa was right. He didn't have to put up with this kind of treatment. Which begged the question, why wasn't he doing something about it? She cocked an ear, listening for sirens or the roar of the bullhead's engine. Maybe he wanted to keep them talking for some reason. She slammed her cup down on the table and it split in two. The remainder of her tea pooled around the broken halves. She stood and gestured to Roman. Let's go. You sure? He nodded, or tried to, but she couldn't get her head to move. Her eyes flew open in a panic. Her face abruptly felt numb, and she couldn't feel her hands and feet. Neo? Roman asked. Neo! She tried to take a step, but it felt like weights were tied to her leg. She barely moved her foot an inch before she was falling over. Papa caught her and held on tight. From this angle, she saw that Roman was similarly paralyzed on the couch, a look of concern frozen on his face. Concern for her. Then Papa started dragging her away. Chapter 23. Meeting the Parents. Roman watched Jimmy Vanille haul his own daughter out of the room, furious. He wanted to stop him, but he couldn't. Not yet. He followed Carmel Vanille with his eyes around the room as she tidied up. She went to pick up the shards of the broken cup Roman had thrown across the room and tisks over the spilled tea on the carpet and the walls. You've clearly been a bad influence on Trivia, she said. She was always a sweet girl. Roman made a sound like a choked laugh. She had her problems, but what girl doesn't? She looked at the painting on the wall with a wistful expression. With Neo out of the commission, it reverted back to its original state, an idealized portrait of a family for a woman who had lost touch with reality. Naturally, that meant Hei Zhong's bullhead was visible for anyone looking for it. Their time here was short. Carmel rolled around. You think we don't know who you are, Georgewick? You think we don't know what's been going on in our daughter's life, even when she isn't here? She lifted a chain around her neck and showed him the pendant dangling from it. A Triskelion. Roman groaned inwardly. Nia's mother had graduated from Lady Browning's Preparatory Academy for Girls too. No wonder she had shipped her daughter off there. And it seemed she was a bit more involved in Lady Beat's plans than most of her former students. In fact, he wondered if Jimmy knew his wife had been using him to spy on Hei Zhong's operations. But Roman couldn't ask any of the questions spinning around his head. Fortunately, it seemed Neo's mother didn't have any trouble talking. We were in deep, she said. Deeper than we should be. Jimmy didn't want to be under Hei's thumb forever. He wanted to start a little side business, and well, you know how that goes. She looked at Roman. Here you are. She straightened a chair, and that had been nudged maybe half an inch when Neo had stumbled and been pulled away. I tried to change his mind, but Jimmy never listens to me. She rolled her eyes in a very Neo way. I'm just supposed to look pretty and smile a lot, which is harder work than you think. but I trained for that. Be seen, not heard. That's living the dream, as Lady B drilled into us. The better to watch and learn, and plot and scheme. She laughed. Jimmy has no idea what's really going on. He never did. I knew what trivia needed, but he wouldn't let me give it to her. He didn't want her to grow up like him. She chuckled, but that was going against her nature. Carmel approached the couch. Roman felt his already sore muscles tighten. She slid his legs off the coffee table and frowned at the marred surface. Lady B will be pleased when I return the data drive you stole, and when I hand you over to little Miss Malachite. I'll make sure she gets hay off our backs once and for all. With him out of the picture, the dust trade will be up for grabs, and Jimmy will rally the council to give him emergency power over the dust imports, distribution, and sales. She winked. But we know who will really be in charge, don't we? In one fluid motion, Roman grabbed her, taking her by surprise, holding her arms at her side with one arm and covering her nose and mouth with the other. You talk too much, Roman said. She struggled, her screams muffled, but she couldn't break his grip. Gradually, she stopped fighting him and she ran out of oxygen and passed out. He dropped her on the couch. Thanks for the tea, but one of the first things I learned on the street is to be careful about what you eat. I didn't have to go to a fancy school for that one. He grabbed the curtain poles from around the room and tied her up with them. Then he waited by the door for Jimmy to come back. He walked into the room completely oblivious to his unconscious wife texting on his scroll. Darling, is he on his way here? Once I give him this data drive and Torchwick, he says all my debts are forgiven. I can't believe this opportunity dropped right into our laps. Isn't that splendid news? Jimmy looked up. He saw his wife. I've heard better news, Roman said. Jimmy spun around, reaching into his pocket, but Roman whacked him on the head with his cane. Jimmy went down. Roman checked the man's pockets and relieved him of a pistol and the data drive. Roman weighed the thing in his hand. This information was hot, but it wasn't the kind of thing that increased in value the longer you held onto it. Some of it would still be damning evidence, but the real usefulness of it was in the current deals going on, which was why Shang and Little Miss wanted it so badly. Maybe even more than they wanted Roman. He might be able to make a deal and get out of this one, but then what? They'd come after him eventually, and what he really wanted was to eliminate both of them as a threat so that he could take over. And there was probably one way to do that, and if he was going to do it, he needed to do it quick before they had company. But first, he needed to find Neo. Chapter 24. Falling In. A few minutes earlier, Neapolitan had never seen her house from this perspective before, either being dragged backwards through the halls by her father. Her heels left scores in the varnished wood floors. Sorry, she thought immediately, and then wondered why she was apologizing. It wasn't her fault, and she had no control over the situation. An uncomfortably familiar feeling for her. I know what you're thinking, Papa said, huffing as he pulled her up the main stairs. That would be a first. He hadn't even heard some of the curses she was yelling at him internally. Neo's mind flailed around in her paralyzed body. Her tongue had never done what it was supposed to, but now the rest of her was traitorous, useless. She was a prisoner in her own body. What is my father doing? He went on. What I've always done, kid. Doing what's best for my family, for you. Trust me, you don't want to get mixed up with Roman Torchwick in the dangerous world he lives in. It changes you. Is that what happened to you? He paused halfway up the stairs to catch his breath. It started out small enough. Zhang offered me an incentive to make sure the contract for justice and transportation in the city went to this family's business. I didn't see any harm in it, making a little extra money. They were a good business, and Zhang is a good person to have on your side. He scowled, which isn't to say he's a good person. Far from it. He lifted Neo up and groaned. I guess you've been eating well at that school of yours, he chuckled. Excuse me? That first job turned into other offers, some of which I was less comfortable with. Higher profile projects, more vendors competing for the same contracts, more interest to factor in. But you don't say no to He Zhang. Meanwhile, the price for yes kept getting higher. He stopped, staring into space. His nostrils flared. And when things got rough, Zhang was always there to help. Pretty soon I owed him money. I had to put myself more and more on the line to pay him back, to stay in his good graces. He lowered his voice to a harsh whisper. Embezzling, taking bribes, stealing from... He caught himself, and his eyes went back and forth wildly. Shh, shh, they have ears everywhere. Eyes too, Neo thought. They continued up, and when he reached the landing, Papa looked around. Zhang owns all this. Did you know that? He owns me. He owns your mother. He owns you. But now, thanks to you, I have something he wants. I can wipe my debts clean, and this time I'm coming out on top. He dropped Neo to the floor with a thud. Ow. They were outside her bedroom. What had been her bedroom. But the wooden door had been replaced with a steel one, and now there was a hand scanner, now connected to a complicated lock that would take her weeks to crack. She wondered what was so important enough to need all that security. The door opened with a whoosh, and he picked her up again. He backed through the doorway, sliding her over a threshold and along the floor. It looked like a road carpet. He pulled her alongside a canopy bed and hauled her up into it. He rolled her onto her back and arranged her hands across her stomach in a funeral pose. Then he reached into her pouch and pulled out the data drive. I'll be back after Zhang takes this and that crook away. We can have a family dinner again, just like old times. Yeah, right. Don't go anywhere, he chuckled. He kept laughing, growling louder and louder as he switched off the lights and closed the door with a hiss and a definitive kerchunk. The soundproof door finally cut off his manic laughter, and Nia was left alone with her thoughts. She didn't know how long she lay there, staring up at the canopy of her bed in the dark and silence. Is this what it's like to be dead? She waited. After some time had passed, a patch of light crept along the ceiling, and she heard the crunch of a car in the gravel driveway. She waited. Another set of lights, coming in faster. Tires squealing. Gunfire. There was a war going outside her window. She thought about all the things she was going to do to her parents when she escaped from here. She thought about what life might be like after this, if she and Roman somehow survived this. If their friendship survived this. She wondered if she would ever be free again. Eventually, she felt a painful tingling in her extremities. She wiggled her fingers and toes experimentally. She was getting her mobility back. She still couldn't feel much, but that hadn't stopped her before. She forced herself to sit up, nearly tipping over in the bed, and swung her feet down to the floor. She pushed herself off the bed to see if they would hold her weight. Not yet, but she could crawl. It felt like swimming in sand and it hurt, but she made it to the window and looked out. Little Miss Malachite's forces and He Zhang's were trading gunfire from behind their vehicles. They were also shouting at each other, likely trading insults, but she couldn't hear them through the glass. She pounded on the window, but it had been reinforced with an Atlesian hard light force field. There'd be no jumping out of it this time. She pulled herself up and stumbled over to the door, more falling than walking. She couldn't even pierce the steel door to get the locking mechanism if she wanted to. She tried banging on the door, but her fists didn't even make the sound on the metal. She sat down and looked around her room. It was mostly faithful recreation of her bedroom, with the same furniture, the bed, the dresser, the bookcase. But it was empty of her belongings. There was no personality. No one lived here. Which was strange, because if she didn't live here, why did they go through the trouble of restoring her room? Why put a heavy-duty lock on the door and an expensive force field on the window? You didn't do that to keep someone in. There were security measures to keep someone out. And only one person had access to the room she knew of. The door mechanism whirred. Neo moved fast, as fast as she could manage with her laggy body. She had grabbed her parasol from where it had fallen under the bed and extended the blade, pointing it at the door, prepared to rush Papa as soon as it opened. Whoosh! Neo opened and Neo launched herself. Whoa! Roman dropped something and dove out of the way as Neo embedded her sword in the opposite wall. Mama wasn't gonna like that either, but Neo had never liked the wallpaper. She turned toward Roman and put her hands over her heart. Don't get mushy. You would have done the same for me. She looked off into the distance, her mouth pushed up thoughtfully. Yeah, you did do the same for me, but who's counting? We're a team, right? Neo grinned. She had really thought she would be trapped in there and would never see Roman again. But how had he gotten inside the room without? She looked down and saw Papa's limp body on the floor. She put a hand on her hip and gestured at him. Really? He's not dead, Roman said. Neo studied her father. Just a little while ago, he had drugged her and then locked her in a room, claiming it was because he wanted to protect her. But from here, it looked like he had been trying to protect himself. She hadn't felt any emotions when she thought about him being dead. No sadness or joy or disappointment, no fear, no love. Perhaps he had been distant with her for so long, she now felt the same about him. I looked all over the house for you. There must be 40 rooms in here. She flashed 5 fingers at him, and then 1 hand, and then 1 finger. 56 then? For 3 people? That's a lot. And every one of them is filled with expensive junk. No wonder your dad is broke. Anyway, I finally found this door, and it was clear there was something important behind it. He gestured to Neo. A father's greatest treasure, that kind of thing. But seriously, I've seen weaker security in a crime boss's personal vault. I had to go all the way back upstairs and grab the guy just so I could use his handprint to open the door. Neo unsheathed her sword blade and pointed it to Papa's hand. She made a hacking motion and then lifted a brow. Roman stared at her. See, this is why I need you around. Neo crouched down and went through her father's pockets. She came up with a scroll, but there was no sign of a data drive. Roman saw her frustration. Don't worry, I've got the drive, and I've been trying to figure out what to do with it. Look, there's a lot you need to know, but we don't have time right now. It won't be long before Little Miss and his Sean decide they should work together to break in and capture us. He paused. You hear that? Nia listened, but she didn't hear anything. She pretended to clean an ear with 1 finger. Exactly. They've stopped fighting, which is bad news for us because several floors down they heard banging at the front door, broken glass. I think the only way to get them off our backs is to turn the heat up on them, Roman said. Neo nodded. She typed on her scroll. What do you need? A computer, he said, and a distraction. She propelled Roman down the hall to her father's office. This door was locked too, but it was just a normal door, a normal lock, which she kicked in with her normal boot. She and Roman piled into the office. He fired up the computer and groaned when he saw the password screen. The camera above the screen lit up. Be a dear and go fetch your father's head, will you? He asked. Neo shuddered with a grimace. She transformed into her father and let the computer scan his face. The screen lit up. Roman sat at the desk and began plugging cables into the data drive. I think I can get this to work, but it's going to take a while, and even longer to upload it all. Neo caught her reflection in the mirror over the credenza. Her father's face looked back at her. She wondered how he became the type of person to risk losing everything just to get what he wanted. She wondered if she would make the same choice. She thought about how angry he'd been when she set that fire. You could have blown us all up, he said. Yet it seemed like an exaggeration. What if it wasn't? Neo bolted out of the room. Don't worry, I'll be fine, Roman called. Just keep them off my back. She ran down the hall and toward her room. Her dad wasn't lying there anymore. She slowed down and crept more slowly and quietly. She shifted her form until she had looked like she had at age 6, playing sneak tag with her invisible friend. She peeked around the edge of the room and door into the room. Her bed was shoved to one side, and Papa was pulling out long boxes out of a crawl space under her floor. What? He was muttering to himself. I'll give it all to them. It's the only way. It's the only way. His head jerked up, and he saw her by the door. Trivia? He asked. Sweetheart, you didn't leave. Come here, help me with this. Neo approached warily, so he could get a look at what he had been stashed under their bed. Crate after crate of dust crystals. Neo's mouth fell open. She pointed at it all, and then spread her hands in a question. I've been settling this dust aside for some time. It's our nest egg. He squinted. Did you change your hair? She didn't bother with the scroll this time. She made her question appear in the air in front of her, floating between her and her father. In my bedroom? He stuck his hand into a box and pulled out a handful of red gems. Burn dust. If Zhang ever found out I'd been stealing from him, he wouldn't be able to prove if he couldn't find it. No one would ever think to look in your room. He tapped his forehead. I'm smarter than your mother thinks. She underestimates me. Zhang underestimates me. But I had everyone fooled for all these years. He frowned at her. Until you messed it all up. First you started that fire, right on top of all this valuable dust. Neil swallowed the hairs on her crawling on the back of her neck. The dust wasn't just valuable, it was incredibly volatile. She'd been sitting on top of a massive bomb that would have leveled the whole neighborhood. If the fire had sparked it, she never would have known what hit her. She was still standing on a bomb, but in this case it was Papa who was unstable. He jumped up. Then you and Torchwick arrived. Were you looking for this? How did you know about it? Neo held out her hands, more in warning to him than out of fear. She changed back into herself and then backed away slowly. You're a witch, just like the ones in those silly stories you read. You stalked toward her. Neo held up a match and ignited it with her thumbnail. He froze. She smiled and tossed it toward the box of dust. Hello, Spacey Exile. Welcome. How are you doing tonight? I hope you're doing well. As he dove to catch it, she whirled around and fled the room for the last time in her life. She slammed the door on him and leaned against it, breathing heavily. The machinery whirred and rumbled against her back as the locks engaged. She relaxed her semblance, making the illusory match fade. Thank you for the head pats. Thank you very much. She heard muffled scream and she heard muffled thumping on the door. But Papa was the only one who could let himself out. Chapter 25, Smoke and Mirrors. Roman was no computer genius, but because he didn't trust others to do his dirty work for him, he knew just enough to be dangerous. And when it came down to it, he was fine with poking and trying things until something worked. Fortunately, the data drive seemed fairly plug and play, as soon as he was clicking through folder after folder of incriminating and private videos. He wished he had some popcorn and a big enough TV screen to scroll through some of the good stuff, but what he really needed was time and a good way to get this stuff out to the public. So he called the Vale News Network. I have a hot scoop for Lisa Lavender, he said when some intern answered. It's the middle of the night, the woman said. Something new is always happening. That's why it's news. I'll take a message. You will connect me to her right now, or I'll take my news elsewhere. But she's going to be upset, extremely upset to miss out on the story of the century. That's quite the hyperbole, she said. Well, it's certainly the biggest thing that happened to Vale all week. Who is this, anyway? Roman Torchwick. She paused. The Roman Torchwick? The very same. I've never heard of you. Roman sighed. Well, Lisa has, so get her on the phone right now. A text message came in from Neo. They're in the house. I'm leading them to the dust cache in my bedroom. They should distract them while we get away. The what cache? Roman texted back. Papa's been stealing dust from Zhang's shipment for years and hiding it in my room. Try to keep up. Zhang would definitely want that back. Little Miss Malachite wouldn't turn her nose to a small fortune of dust either. Roman wanted to, but if it was a matter of life or dust, well, he'd have to think about it that more. This is Lisa Lavender, a voice broken on the line. I recognize your voice from TV. Is this really Roman Tortrick? It is. What have you got? I'm a big fan. Roman smiled. Of ratings, and it's not every day that a criminal mastermind calls me. Roman nodded. So I'll take what I can get. Roman scowled. Do you usually roast your informants like this? Oh no, she said. I'm just trying to keep you busy on the line while the police trace your call. Roman slapped his forehead. I do actually have information for you that I think the police will be interested in too. Let's hear it. Little Miss Malachite has been spying on people in Vale using cameras hidden in Triskelion pins worn by women in very high security positions. Lisa Lavender was quiet for a moment. Well, Roman said. Sorry, I just had to throw something out. You were saying, do you have proof? A whole data drive worth of it, ready to beam to your server. Okay, I'll have someone text you an address and password. She cleared her throat. And Roman? What? I love the flowers. Neo figured Roman would be a bigger target for Little Miss and Hei Zhang, so she took on his form and worked her way downstairs. They weren't as quiet as she was, and she knew every nook and cranny, except the secret one in her own bedroom, apparently. It was a simple matter to sneak around and subdue the spiders and Zhang's men, who of course had split up to search the house. She encountered Lady Pete and Hei Zhang in the parlor, standing over Mama's body. Little Miss wasn't with them. Mama was tied up, but Neo couldn't tell if she was alive or not. Neo stopped to think about how she felt about that. Should she try to save her mother, or leave her to face whatever fate awaited her with her fellow criminals? Her scroll buzzed. You good? I'm all set here. The files are transferring. We should go. Wait for my signal, Neo said back. Roman was counting on her. She darted out of the doorway and dashed across the room. It's Torchwick, Zhang shouted. Neo heard his footsteps behind her. She doubted Lady Beat would be able to keep up. Zhang followed her all the way up the stairs, firing shot after shot after. She got to the top floor first. Roman heard gunshots in the house, and Zhang bellowing his name. That would be Neo, he said. The files were done transferring, so the data drive itself was almost worthless. It was almost time to go. He sat down again and pulled up Jimmy Vanille's files. He was responsible for pulling a lot of strings in the city, so he had to have something interesting on here. Something like spreadsheets, contacts, manifests, and information on deals below the board. Roman grinned. This could be worth almost as much as what he'd just given up. He copied the contents over to the data drive and slid it back into his pocket. He snuck into a hallway and saw Hei Zhang standing there, pointing his gun at Roman Torchwick. Neo appeared next to Roman and made him jump. She gave him a look. What took me so long? I'll show you later, he said. Neo grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the stairs. Got nothing to say now, Torchwick? Zhang said. Roman opened his mouth. Neo shook his head. At that moment, that Zhang fired his machine gun at the duplicate Roman. They bolted down the stairs. Zhang's cursing followed them down. He'll be happier when he finds that dust, Roman said. They reached the first floor and headed for the front door. Roman opened it. Coast looks clear, he said. A moment later, a spotlight shone on them. He shielded his eyes and peered out as Neo grabbed his other hand. A bullhead was hovering over the lawn, its spotlight and guns trained on them. In the illuminated cockpit, he saw his old friend Brick at the controls, with little Miss Malachite herself sitting beside him. I guess this is it, Roman said. It was the end of the line. Neo squeezed his hand. He glanced at her and was surprised to see Karma Vanille in her place. Neo? Roman asked. He glanced down at himself and saw he was wearing Jimmy Vanille's tacky shoes and presumably his face. Neo tugged him forward, and they walked down the stairs and along the path slowly toward a car parked in the driveway. A spotlight followed them. He looked nervously up at the bullhead. Little Miss was watching them closely. "I'd be surprised if she let us go," Roman said. "Unless you can hold these disguises indefinitely, once they capture us, they'll figure out who we are." Neo's brows knit together, either from the concern or concentration. "We need to give her a bigger target, something she wants enough to draw her attention while we get away." He stopped walking. "While you get away. She's mainly interested in me. Drop that disguise and I'll distract her. You get out of here. And never look back." She shook her head defiantly. He tried to pull his hand free, but she only held on more tightly. The bullhead moved toward them slowly. He could be wrong. Little Miss might just decide to cut her losses and write this whole thing off as a lost job. Wipe all of them out from spite, and just be sure that whoever knew about their operations in Vale were no longer a threat. "Please, you have to let go." Neo's chin trembled. She glanced back at the house and then up at Roman's face. Then she started waving frantically at the bullhead. "Neo? What was she doing?" For a moment he wondered if she was going to turn him in and try to strike a deal for herself, which he couldn't really blame her for trying. He even kind of expected it, given his track record with partners. Another day, another Roman might have done the same. Anything to survive. Neo stared down the bullhead, stared down Little Miss Malachite, and pointed up at the house. Little Miss turned to look. Roman couldn't believe when the ship slowly turned away from them to face the house. She had taken the bait. But what was the bait? The spotlight illuminated the upper corner of the house. Two figures were visible on a third-floor window. Their backs were turned, but they were clearly him and Neo. The figures turned out to look at the bullhead. The fake Roman flashed a rude gesture, and the fake Neo stuck her tongue out. Neo dropped Roman's hand and started running toward her father's car in the driveway. Roman followed her lead. She looked like herself again, unable to maintain multiple illusions, and not really needing to now that the attention was off them, for the moment. While Neo reached the car, she opened the driver's side door and climbed inside. Roman hopped into the passenger side. She was too short to see over the steering wheel. "Do you need a booster seat?" Roman asked. She glared at him. He raised his hands innocently. Then he heard gunfire from the bullhead as Little Miss began attacking the window, trying to kill them. The window was holding up shockingly, thanks to the hard light force field blocking the bullets. "It's shielded?" Roman said. Well, the walls around the window weren't, as they were crumbling under the gunfire. The gun stopped. Neo buckled her seatbelt. She tapped his legs. Roman ignored her and kept watching as the bullhead fired a missile, which finally broke through the hard light force field. Then he got it. The room was protected because it was where Jimmy Vanille had been stockpiling dust. Roman grabbed for his seatbelt and fumbled blindly with the clasp. Too late. There was a brilliant flash of white light, followed by a moment later by a tremendous boom and a crack of thunder. Then the shockwave came, tearing through the mansion. The bullhead lost control and came down beyond the driveway, just past the tree line. When the force hit the car Roman and Neo were in, it pushed the vehicle into the air. It turned over and over until it finally came to a rest on the other end of the driveway. Chapter 26. Friends to the End. Neapolitan staggered out of the crumpled car. Her aura was almost depleted, but she was all right. She checked on Roman. He had been thrown clear of the vehicle as he tumbled through the air and was lying on his back on the lawn. He was unconscious, but breathing. Unfortunately, his hat wasn't going to make it. He had landed on it and crushed it. Neo looked over at her house, or what was left of it. The explosion of all the dust packed in her room had leveled the top 2 floors of the house, and the first floor collapsed in on itself. She sat beside Roman and watched the sun rise behind the rubble. She heard sirens in the distance. Roman gasped and sat up. His eyes squinted in pain. "Wow," he said, when he saw what remains of the house. "Did anyone make it out of that? Zhang?" He hesitated. Your parents? He said softly. Neo shook her head. Papa had been locked in that room at the epicenter of the detonated black dust. He'd been killed by the only thing he truly cared about, his ambitions, and killed by his daughter. Little Miss might have been the one to pull the trigger, but Neo had pointed her guns at her father and Mama. Roman paused. You all right, Neo? She shrugged. She really didn't know. Well, she wasn't not all right. As far as she was concerned, Trivia Vanille was buried under that mess too. Neapolitan was the sole survivor. With her parents gone, she didn't have anything or anyone to run from anymore. She was finally free. You know, I lost my parents when I was younger than you, and I turned out okay, Roman said in a lighter voice. Neil looked at him and cracked a smile. He caught a lock of her hair and showed it to her. It was white. This is new. It suits you. Why would she have done that with her semblance? The sirens grew louder. Soon this place is going to be lousy with cops, reporters, fire brigades. He glanced at the destroyed car behind them, then at the bullhead they had flown in on. Think we can get that junk heap back in the sky? Neo and Roman trudged toward it side by side. The bullhead, already riddled with bullets, its windshield shattered and gone, had sustained additional damage from the explosion. But most of the pre-flight checks turned up green, and whatever that red light was, she would deal with it later. You can just drop me whatever, Roman said. She shot him an anxious look. Unless you want to stick together? And she gave him a look that she hoped expressed how incredibly clueless she thought he was. Dum-dum. Can't imagine why you want to hang out with someone like me. With your abilities, you could be anything you wanted, even a huntress. Neo burst out laughing. She turned to him and briefly transformed into Vale's most famous huntress, Glinda Goodwitch. She saluted him. Can you imagine that? Maybe not, Roman said. But the criminal world isn't ready to deal with you yet. I mean, I'm still not interested in having a sidekick. She glowered. But I couldn't ask for a better partner. Neo leaned over and kissed Roman on the cheek. His face went red. It was fun to mess with him sometimes. She tousled his hair for good measure. He needed a new hat. Stop, he said, pulling away. Neo quickly returned to the controls and started to raise the bullhead. It's a shame we literally blew a fortune in dust, he said. There's more where that came from. He patted his pocket. For all his many faults, your father had a decent plan. Control all the dust in the city, you can control everything else. It's just too bad he didn't have you helping him make it work. But with Heixiong out of the picture and Little Miss retreating to Mistral, we're the only game in town. Neo frowned. She didn't really care about running things or cornering the market on dust. She just wanted to do whatever she wanted. And at that moment, what she wanted was to help Roman set the world on fire. Once they were at cruising altitude, Neo looked at Roman. Where to? He grinned. Your choice. On the horizon, she spotted other ships on their way from the city center. That decided that. She steered them in the opposite direction at full throttle. She leaned back in her seat and closed her eyes, feeling the warm sun on her face and the wind blowing through her hair. For once, she wasn't worried about anything. No one was ever going to catch Roman and Neo. The end. And that, my friends, is RWBY Roman Holiday. I hope that I was able to help you relax today. Maybe I have helped you fall asleep. Who knows? I don't. But for right now, I think that's where I'm going to call it. I don't have anything else to do after all. Nothing else to read. When I do ASMR streams, I do not read out. So I'm going to just end stream. But I hope all of you have a wonderful night. I hope you sleep well. And remember, just, well, be a good person. Relax. And I hope you have a wonderful night. Thank you for tuning in, and I will see all of you next time.